This is the chapters 10 and 11 lecture, and we'll start with water and the electrolytes. Water is the most essential of the nutrients in terms of the number of days we can live without it. Only about a week or so for most individuals. When compared to other nutrients, it takes weeks and weeks and months for us to actually be killed by a lack of that nutrient. So we need water. It also takes up about 2/3 of our body weight, and 90% of our blood plasma is water. We watch weight closely in long-term care facilities, and when we see rapid shifts in weight, we typically think of fluid balance. A quick loss in weight can be dehydration. A quick gain can be fluid retention. Many functions which you can review on your own and distributed in a number of spaces in the body. It can move from space to space, and we talked about that when we talked about proteins. Albumin holds fluid in your bloodstream. Without albumin, the fluid moves into tissue spaces. As with all nutrients, maintaining a balance is what's essential, so we have to look at the intake and the output. In terms of intake, we think of drink, and most drinks are mostly water, but food provides a good amount of water as well, and our metabolism does provide a bit of water. In terms of output, of course, urine may be what we think of, but in certain conditions, we lose a lot of fluid in sweat normally, and in certain conditions, a tremendous amount. And then feces contains water, and when there's diarrhea, you lose more. So there are conditions that can throw this water balance off. One may be not attending to drinking enough, and some people actually experience dehydration. Some end up in hospitals simply because they weren't consuming enough fluid. This is again something we watch closely in long-term care facilities. We also are at risk of dehydration when we are excreting more urine than normal, losing more in our feces because of a diarrheal illness, or perhaps working in very hot conditions where we're perspiring quite a bit. Sources of water in the diet are listed here. Take a look at this. A diet that includes a lot of fruits, vegetables, and foods soaked in water like rice or perhaps beans provides significant amounts of water. We do have safeguards within our body to trigger thirst and retain fluid when necessary. So you'll see here that when your saliva decreases and your blood volume decreases, this triggers thirst, and we should drink, and that should then remedy the situation. We also have a hormone, the antidiuretic hormone, that is triggered by a decrease in blood volume and an increase in solute concentration in that blood. Forgot to mention in the long-term care facility, when blood sodium levels increase, this also keyed us into the fact that the patient may be dehydrated. And you'll see there that then the body holds on to more fluid. When we hold on to more fluid, that's a consequence of dehydration, and that is signaled by the color of our urine, with a darker urine that's more odoriferous indicating dehydration. Be sure to look through all these slides very closely and watch the videos. Quickly, some comments on electrolytes, sodium, potassium, and chloride. They're very important for a number of functions: nerve conduction, blood pressure regulation, and muscle contraction being 3 of them. When we see a deficiency of fluid or these electrolytes, it can cause severe cramping that can be debilitating. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about sodium and potassium before we look at the food levels of these nutrients. We get too much sodium in our diet and too little potassium. Too much sodium tends to increase the blood pressure, too little potassium, the same. The ratio of those two also seems to be important. Sodium is found in more processed food, and potassium is lower in more processed food. And in less processed, more whole foods, we get more potassium and less sodium. So the shift from less processed to more processed does our body good in so many different ways, but especially when we're looking at blood pressure and heart health. And yet, our food supply is loaded with sodium. You may remember that the dietary guidelines recommended no more than 2,300 milligrams sodium for an entire day. Look at some of these numbers. Incredible, right? So this becomes a problem. Be sure to click into the videos, but here are some tips. So when shopping, look for foods lower in sodium, skip the salted foods, use more fresh and frozen foods without the seasoning packs and without the sauces. Frozen fruits and vegetables are just fine if they're not sugared and salted, and they typically are not. You don't need to add salt to your cooking water. Learn to season with other herbs and spices. Limit use of salt at the table. Watch what you add. And then some tips for eating out as well. Restaurant food and fast food tends to be very high in sodium. Wanted to make a mention of some other types of salt. Kosher salt, just as high in sodium. Sea salt, just as high in sodium. A lot of people think sea salt is somehow a salt substitute. It has a few more minerals. You may be able to use less because of the different tastes, but it's not lower in sodium teaspoon to teaspoon. We often think of hypertension or high blood pressure as being the problem caused by too much sodium, and in fact, it is one of them. You can see here that there are many risk factors for high blood pressure, and certainly our diet is one of them. These are the normal and high or problem areas for hypertension. These are the newer values. To have a healthy blood pressure, you need to be below 120/80. So keep that in mind. I think that is a test question. We've got a diet to control blood pressure. You may have heard of it. In this class, I think you must read about it. It's the DASH diet, and you can see the effects here. The DASH diet, that stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension, and it significantly lowered both systolic and diastolic blood pressure. Besides that, the DASH diet has been proven to slow cognitive decline, to, keep you healthy, to help manage weight. It is a diet which adds more of the minerals calcium, magnesium, and potassium, and that seems to be the reason for its effect on blood pressure. So it's more about what to add more of: fruits and vegetables, low-fat dairy products. It has a moderate amount of sodium, not too high in sodium, but it's not drastically low. And you'll see it's also lower in the animal proteins as well. Be sure to read over this. I actually love this chart. I think one of the problems we have with treating and counseling around high blood pressure is that we tend to say, watch the salt and maybe lose some weight, but it's really about much more than that. It's about eating more fruits and vegetables. It's about managing weight but increasing physical activity, not going overboard with alcohol, quitting smoking, and learning how to handle stress. Let's look now at minerals and their impact on bone health. You'll read about major minerals and trace minerals. And when we look at minerals in the diet, we see kind of a similar array as when we looked at vitamins. Variety is important. There's crossover, but there are certain groups that are really high in minerals. And you'll see here that when you cut out one of those food groups, you have to work hard at making sure you're getting what you're missing from the others. We talk about bioavailability when we speak about most minerals. Bioavailability is the amount that's available to your body. In the case of many minerals, and we'll look at iron and we'll look at calcium as examples for this, bioavailability is very low. We may consume so much, but only absorb 2% of that. And food components in our meals can impair the absorption. So it gets a little tricky when we're talking about these minerals. Not only the amount in food, but how we consume them and how much is absorbed becomes important. These are some of the compounds that can interfere with mineral absorption. Keep in mind, though, the RDAs, the recommendations have been set for the typical American diet and the limited bioavailability. So if you're consuming the typical American diet, you're probably okay if you're meeting your recommendations. If your diet is heavier in vegetables, perhaps and lower in meats, as a vegetarian or a plant-based diet, you may need to be a bit aware of these interactions. Minerals act as cofactors. This is a really nice video about the importance of minerals for brain health, so you may be interested in that. And let's talk about calcium, the most abundant mineral in the body, structure to bones and teeth, but also important regulatory roles, and we need vitamin D to absorb it. Bioavailability is decreased in the presence of these different substances. 99% in the bones and teeth, 1% in our body fluid, but what happens is, let me go back a minute, the bones act as a bank for that 1%. Food sources, so it's fairly limited in a lot of foods, very good in milk. So if you don't eat milk and milk products, you need to work a little harder. You'll see here sardines, but that's not the fish, that's the soft bones in canned sardines and salmon. Some in seeds and beans and greens as well. When you don't meet your needs, supplementation is an option. This is my guideline for supplementation. You need to, as we'll look at osteoporosis, it's really important that you try to meet your goal, because osteoporosis is a horrible disease. You want to keep your bones healthy. If you have a gap, try to fix your diet first. If you can't reach your recommendation, then calcium supplements are an option. But be sure not to take too much. We've shown through research that huge doses of calcium, overdoing it, can actually increase the risk of heart disease because of calcification of blood vessels. So you want to take only what you need to meet the recommendation and in small doses. This says 500 milligrams or less. I'd go even lower than that. Doses of 250 or less. You can get petite calcium tablets that give closer to 250 milligrams of calcium. Look through the regulation of blood calcium, keeping in mind when you don't consume enough calcium in the diet, it will be taken from your bones to feed the blood. So if you were on a very low calcium diet, you wouldn't expect to see low blood calcium. That is instead robbed from the bones. And this is a picture of what happens in the disease osteoporosis. Your bones will thin out over time, forming holes. Watch the video. So what becomes important in terms of bone health? You want to make sure that children have enough calcium and other things which we'll talk about. Even into young adulthood, you're still adding density to bones. So even up until your 30s or so, you're still adding to your peak bone density, and that's very important because after about age 40 or so, peak or bone mass declines. So you see the peak is reached and then a decline. Women have a lower peak bone mass and a sharper decline around menopause due to the loss of estrogen. So women are especially at risk for osteoporosis. But the more mass you can get in your bone, the better before you see that inevitable decline. Look for the risk factors of osteoporosis. There are a number, including race, including age, including gender, but also family history. If you've noticed your older family members losing a number of inches in height and maybe becoming more stooped in posture, that shows a family risk for osteoporosis. Note also that smoking and alcohol are tough on the bones as well. Some of the signs of osteoporosis, unfortunately, we don't get early signs. The earliest would be if a younger woman fell and fractured her wrist when she fell, then they may say, uh-oh, you shouldn't be breaking bones that easily, and send her for a bone density scan. But typically we see the loss in height from the crushed vertebrae. We see perhaps the change in the shape of the spine, what's called the dowager's hump. We may also experience pain from that as well. So all of those would be risk factors, not risk factors, signs of osteoporosis. So what do we do? You need to make sure you get enough calcium, but there's plenty of countries in the world where they consume less calcium than we do, and they have less osteoporosis. So other factors are at play as well. Enough exercise, stop smoking and over drinking, make sure you get enough vitamin D. And there's evidence that too much protein, but especially animal protein, and too much sodium may take a toll on bone density as well. So a more plant-based diet without too much sodium, lots of exercise, enough vitamin D, and enough calcium for sure. Some other minerals, major minerals of importance are phosphorus. It is also important in the bone health. Magnesium. Quick note about magnesium. The UL is set low, and a lot of you will be above the UL, but if you read the footnote, it says only a concern if it comes from pharmaceutical sources. So medications, not food, cause a problem with toxicity. And you can see here non-food sources. Sulfur. Read about sulfur, often found in non-food additives. And we'll leave trace minerals for our last very short lecture.